Hello class. This week we're going to be covering textures and patterns and how to make them and how to display them. We're going to use contact sheets in order to do that. So I'm going to throw in the ways of creating automation such as actions in Photoshop while we're at it. That way we can kind of cover everything to do with repetition. Who wants to do the same thing 4 or 5 times when you can have Photoshop just do it for you? Now, in order to make patterns and textures, you're going to need some tools at your disposal, like the clone stamp tool, the healing brush tool, the patch tool, all those guys. Now, odds are you've already covered these, but in order to make sure that you remember them, I'm going to do a quick refresher on each of these tools and cover them maybe a little more in depth than you might have the last time you used them. That way, I'll know for certain that you have all the skills you need in order to proceed with this assignment. Now we're going to start with the most basic one that's been around since the dawn of Photoshop. Well, not quite, but a very long time, the clone stamp tool. The clone stamp tool is excellent because it can do pretty much everything all the others can, but it's a lot more work. Back when I learned Photoshop, this was the only one at our disposal, so it's what we did. Oh, it was a miracle when they created the patch tool. It was absolutely amazing. But let me show you the clone stamp tool because there are times you don't need all the fancy stuff. Plus there's some options you can use that make it a bit better than you know off the bat. Now, if you've never used it before, you start by holding down the Alt key, and that way you'll get this little crosshair. You'll sample something like these mountains here, and then you'll paint with that sample wherever you go. Now, there are a few things you'll need to take care of first. For starters, I would not recommend painting right on your subject because what you can do is this. I'm going to create a new layer, and now it says current layer for sample, which means if I alt-clicked, it would get nothing because there's nothing on this layer. I can go up to the sample dropdown and choose all layers or current and below in order to sample everything. So I'm going to do all layers, which means whatever we see we'll get. So now I can click, and even though I'm on a transparent layer, I can get those samples wherever I want them. Which brings me to the next thing. Now this is pretty cool because see that I'm basically rebuilding the mountains a little bit offset. But this brings me to the next thing. I hate this preview, like this horrible little thing. Why would I want this? This gets in my way. I can't see what I'm doing, especially when you can turn it on when you need it. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to go up to Window, and I'm going to choose something called Clone Source. Clone Source is the missing tools that should be up in this option panel here, but aren't for reasons I don't know. So once we're in here, you can see we have something called Show Overlay. If I click on Show Overlay, it will disable it. I can see my brush, so I can know what I'm doing. And in fact, if I had a crazy brush like this snail or something, then I can see the cutout and know exactly what's going on. I stick with this 70% hard round brush though, and I'm just going to shrink that down, left bracket key, left bracket, left bracket, left bracket, a whole bunch of times. And now I said that I could turn it on and off. So if I made a sample, what do I mean? If you hold down Alt-Shift, or if you're on a Macintosh, Option-Shift, you can see the preview. Now, the only difference is that you can't just paint right away. You have to release, and then you can paint. And that's it. I'm going to hold down the Alt key real quick, and I'm going to adjust this brush so that it's, there we go, a more appropriate size with some fuzziness. Now, you'll also notice that wherever I go, it's just picking up and continuing, so I can kind of repaint these mountains. I can release my mouse and go somewhere else and do it again and again. The reason for that is I have aligned on up in the options here. If I turn that off, it will bounce back to the original location every time. Let's say this white spot on the mountain. When I paint, I have the white spot in the mountain. When I release and start painting again, I have the white spot in the mountain. Click somewhere else, the white spot in the mountain. See that little crosshair down where the white spot is? That crosshair shows me where exactly the sample is coming from, which means that without aligned, it always bounces back to wherever I sampled it. Like if I go here, sure enough, if I click and release, I have it again and again and again. I could build these really weird mountain ranges to my heart's desire. Now, if I wanted to instead kind of follow my mouse, turn on aligned. And now if I alt-click and go up, the first time I click, it will lock that offset in. And here's what I mean. Watch this panel right here in Clone Source. See how it remembers where the X is? Let me show you again. I'm going to Alt-click. Now watch the panel. It says 0, 0. If I move up, I'm getting a negative Y. It has to do with how computer science determines which direction up and down is. If I go right, I get a positive X. Left, I get a negative X. But when I click, it's locked in place. Now that means wherever I go, you can see that the crosshair will be the same distance away. Okay, pretty neat, right? So those are the two ways of handling the samples and where your samples are coming from. Now there's more to it than that. Let me Control A to select all and delete to clear off this clone layer. There are a few more things. For example, we have these flip horizontal and flip vertical. This will flip the direction that you're moving. This is useful sometimes if you need to copy over like a mirror type situation. Let me show you. So I alt click, and now as I drag, the target moves away from my mouse, which means that I can copy one side of the range over to the other side by moving away. How convenient is that? That's pretty cool. Now, the one that I don't use is I turn that off so it will go normal left and right. We can go up and down again. I don't normally need to flip, but let's say I was going down here. I could make like a water type situation. Now I've got a reflection, but it's really usually meant for if you're going like up and down to get it bouncing around. So that can be useful. I normally don't use it. There's an additional tool. You have the ability to warp your height and width of the stuff being sampled. Let me show you what I mean. Let's do a height of 10% instead of 100%. Okay, Alt click on this mountain, go up here. See how it's flat and weird? That's because it's 10% of its original height. You can also make it bigger. Here it is at 500. I think the cap's at 400% of the original height. So, whoops, let me alt click and see how wide it is and distorted. It's because it's being stretched out pretty well, right? We can also do that to the width. Maybe set the height back to 100 and set the width to 200. Now it's super wide and funky in that direction. Okay, so you can do transformations on the fly if you want. You'll notice that I skipped a little bit up here. These are our clone sources. We get to have up to 5 of them. So if I were to make, let's clear this out again. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I, for some reason, set that in to 1%. Whoops. And I want this to be at 100%. Boop, boop. Enter. Okay. Let me just Control A, delete. Okay, we're cleared out. So let's say I wanted to sample this cloud, and I wanted to also sample this mountain range. So now if I click here, I've got a cloud. And if I click here, I've got mountain range. Back to cloud, back to mountain range, back to cloud. Ta-da, that's it. So you can do all these. Now it's pretty interesting too. It will alert you if it disappears. For example, if I alt click on this layery chunk, make a new layer, and then throw the original one away, it should come up with an alert. Oh, unless you have aligned on, in which case it won't care. So, all right, let's do this again. Let's duplicate this layer. Alt click. So we've got this lined as off. Going to throw this away. And oh, it's smart now. Okay, so in this version of Photoshop, it tries to compensate. If you're on an older version of Photoshop, when you delete that source, you're going to get a little alert box showing up here, and it'll look like a little warning sign. So I wasn't aware that it no longer did that, but hey, it no longer does that. Cool. Well, good news for everyone involved. Next up on the list, we have the ability to rotate. So let's do a rotate by, these are by degrees if I remember correctly, not radian. So 360 degrees is all the way around, 180 is halfway around. So now I'll alt click the mountain. And if I hold Alt Shift, you'll see what it's doing. It's flipped upside down. I can do less, like 90 degrees. Now, if I Alt click and I'm going to hold down Alt Shift, yeah, sure enough, it's now a 90-degree motion, which means if I move left and right, it's moving up and down. And if I go up and down, it's moving left and right because it's moving everything as though it's a 90-degree motion. I would find this more useful if it actually just rotated the sample for you and left your mouse alone. But oh well, you can't win them all. Here we go. I've got like some kind of a crazy Inception world now where we've got mountain range upon mountain range. Huzzah. Let me undo that so that I get that back to the standard position. And let me show you down here. We have normal, darken, lighten, and difference. These will make more sense later when we cover blending modes and things. But essentially, it will make a darker sample, or it should. A different sample, which will have like a crazy effect, or it should. I'm beginning to notice that it's not affecting. Here we go. It is affecting it. The colors that I have are kind of preventing us from noticing. But wait, I'm recalling something. That's right. I'm sorry. That's my mind playing a trick on me. This mode is where that happens. This mode is the overlay. So if you have the show overlay on, you can have it in normal. Got those mixed up, sorry. You can have the darken, so it's a darker preview. You can have the lighten. You can have the difference, which is actually more useful than you'd think. When we cover difference, it'll make more sense as to why. Up here is the mode that it's painting straight on. So if we wanted to make a darker one, we could multiply. You'd see how much darker that is. That's what I was thinking of. And yeah, sure enough, because of the colors in the mountain, it's not having a really big effect right away. You have to do it a few times to start getting the effect. So I wasn't crazy about that. It is also the image. Okay, so that just leaves a few more things in the clone source. Let's go for these little guys. All right, so let's say, for example, you took off, well, let me set this back to normal real quick. Let's say, for example, you took off clipped. So you know how before on our show overlay, we had just in the mouse, now we have everything. If you take off show overlay, that won't matter. This just, all this stuff has to do with show overlay. It should also work with Alt Shift. So you can see we have this huge thing. So let's go ahead and put clipped back on. Turn off for a second. Notice how insane this is. If we're trying to paint, we can see exactly what we're painting on, but we can't see what the result is or where we painted, right? It's kind of crazy. So let me undo that. Now, if you turn on auto hide, you'll see the whole thing, but then when you click, it will go away. You can't see it. So normally with clipped on, you won't know the difference between auto hide or not. You may notice the difference if you've changed your mode. Let's see actually if the lightning causes any difference either. Here it is before. No, not really, because I'll go through. So really, if you have a mode, let's go for something absolutely insane like where are you? Hard mix. So get that right in. As we go through, auto hide supposedly will hide the process that you have selected, but honestly I don't see that happening, so they might have taken it out in the more current version. Auto hide's not going to make a big difference in most parts of your life. If you notice that your preview's getting in the way or having problems, auto hide should take care of that. You also have invert, which is going to be one of those guys that shows you the inversion, and let me turn off show overlaid, but otherwise it's fine, right? So if you have show overlay and clipped normal, we should see inversion land until we click, and then it goes to normal. So if you're working with kind of fine details, sometimes the inversion will make it bright enough so you can see what's going on, which is nice. Again, I normally don't use show overlay. So the weird thing to me is auto hide, which, you know, it should still function, but it doesn't seem to be behaving the way that I'd expect. So maybe that's a mystery for another day. We'll look into that one. Okay, that leaves frame offset and lock frame. The thing about the frame offset is that has to do with doing video editing or animation editing in Photoshop. So Photoshop has something called a timeline. And the idea is that if you have multiple frames going on and some weird glitch happens at some point in the background, you can go several frames forward where the glitch wasn't there, and you can paint from a sample forward in time. We're not doing that right now, so I don't really want to get into the timeline right this minute. We will be touching on that later in the semester. It's so useful. It's definitely something that we need to cover. So we will get into that. However, we're not going to do that now. So one other thing, let's leave the show overlay on. If I remember correctly, oh, it's going to get mad at me. You should be able to, maybe I'm misremembering. Could have sworn. There are key commands for many of these on the keyboard, but it looks like they might have changed them in this version. I believe to do the scaling, it's Control or the Apple key on, which is Command key on Macintosh, and then the bracket keys, and you should be able to move around, but there might be more to it these days. And sure is looking like it. So that's just the standard tool. Oh, looks like it's Shift now. Okay, well, no, wait. Sorry, no, that's just the hardness. That's what it's supposed to do. Maybe you have to click it. We'll save that one for another day. I rarely use this enough to need to use the keyboard commands, as you can tell that I've forgotten from the time that I started doing this video a few minutes ago to this point, because I had it written down. I don't want to waste your time, because basically this is the clone stamp tool. And let's go ahead and move on to the next tool on the list. But real quick, up here, this is your clone source panel. If you don't want to go to window, you can toggle that on and off. And if you want to select a different brush, boom, brush settings can pop up right on there as well. So you can bring those up and down. They're right available. Other than that, I think we have the ignore adjustment layers from cloning, which is really useful if you have some adjustment layers happening. For example, let's say we had levels down here, and then we just moved the layer so we could actually get to our levels, right? So now if we're on layer 2, we take a sample point and we paint super dark. If we tell it to ignore that, we take a sample and we paint super bright, because we know it's much brighter. And we'll do this weird mix between it because I accidentally left hard mix on. So let's just turn that back to normal. There you go. So you can use that. That's super useful. I think a lot of people forget about that. And you have the choice of using pressure. I'm using a mouse right now, so that's not going to do me any good. But if you have a Cintiq or a Wacom or touchscreen or any of those guys, you can just click and hold. All right, that covers it for Clone Stamp, except for the key commands for doing strange warps. I don't think you're going to get into that. You know what, though? Let me pause it for a second. I'll dig that out, and I will tell them to you real quick. Hold on. Movie magic. Okay, I've dug it out. What I was forgetting was you actually have to hold down the Alt-Shift, which makes sense. So just to demonstrate this, I'll chuck this adjustment level layer. And so if we hold down Alt-Shift, we'd get the preview if we didn't have it and all that good stuff. But we have a few more commands. We can nudge our source around by using the arrow keys while holding down Alt-Shift. Although, again, it doesn't seem to be going on my version, which makes me think that we have encountered, yet again, an issue with the fact that I don't have the 19.1 update. So let me just tell you what those key commands are anyway. So it should be Alt-Shift, left and right arrow, up and down arrow would change the offset. However, that is not occurring on this. We should have, for the rotation, Alt-Shift, less than, well, that one's working, and greater than to do the rotations. Well, that one's working fine, so that's interesting. So I'm going to say it's probably a glitch on my system. Yeah, it's not nudging it at all. Look at that. Okay, and then you can scale it with Alt-Shift and bracket down to make it smaller and bracket up to make it bigger. And I think this is actually more useful a lot of the times if you're going to be scaling than using the width and height. All right, that's everything for the Clone Stamp tool. I will post links to other YouTube videos in the class so that you guys can delve even further. There's some great ones. It's like another 40 or 50 minutes of Clone Stamp if you're still not comfortable with it. I'm guessing, though, that you've probably covered a bunch of it. So for now, just keep going with these videos, and I will see you on the next one.